Sometimes the law doesn't arrive in a courtroom. Sometimes it rides in on two wheels. The afternoon sun hung heavy over a quiet stretch of county highway just outside Cedar Ridge, the kind of road where the asphalt shimmered in the summer heat, and the air smelled faintly of dust and motor oil. And in the distance, a black motorcycle rolled steadily along at about 45 miles per hour, the deep rumble of its engine echoing across the open fields. The rider was a tall black man in his late 50s, calm posture, steady hands on the handlebars, his worn leather jacket moving slightly in the warm wind as if it had traveled thousands of miles before this moment. And maybe it had, because the way he rode carried the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to rush. His name was Marcus Reed, though no one on that empty highway knew it yet. And the only thing anyone could see was an older Harley cruising peacefully down the road until a pair of flashing red and blue lights suddenly burst to life behind him. A patrol SUV accelerated quickly, tires humming on the pavement as it closed the distance. And within seconds the loudspeaker crackled with a firm command for the motorcycle to pull over. Marcus slowed without hesitation, guiding the bike onto the gravel shoulder where tiny stones popped beneath the tires and the engine settled into a soft idle. Dust floated through the warm air as Officer Derek Collins stepped out of the cruiser, adjusting his belt and walking forward with the slow confidence of someone used to being obeyed, his partner officer, Tyler Grant, remaining near the vehicle while watching the scene unfold. Collins stopped a few feet from the motorcycle and looked it up and down with narrowed eyes, the way someone studies an object they've already decided they don't like. The Harley was old but well kept, black paint slightly faded, chrome reflecting the harsh sunlight, the kind of machine that carried stories in every scratch and mile marker. Collins tilted his head and spoke with a tone that carried both authority and judgment as he said, "That bike doesn't look road legal to me. Not around here." And Marcus turned the engine off slowly before removing his gloves with patient, deliberate movements, the quiet sound of leather brushing against leather almost disappearing beneath the distant buzz of cicadas in the fields. He looked up calmly, meeting the officer's gaze without challenge or fear, just steady composure, and replied that the motorcycle was fully registered and inspected under state law, the paperwork inside the saddlebag if the officer wanted to see it. But Collins barely glanced at the bag before shaking his head with a short laugh that carried across the empty road, the kind of laugh that told everyone listening he had already made up his mind. A pickup truck slowed as it passed, the driver turning his head to watch, sensing the tension building like thunder behind a clear sky. Collins stepped closer to the motorcycle, boots crunching on gravel, circling it once while examining the pipes and frame, as if searching for something wrong, even if nothing obvious appeared. And after a moment he stopped beside the front wheel, arms folded, the sun glinting off his badge as he said quietly but firmly that sometimes people think they can bend the rules. Out here, thinking nobody notices, thinking the law is just a suggestion. Marcus listened without interrupting, the wind gently stirring the dry grass along the roadside while a thin line of dust drifted across the shoulder. Then Collins added something that would set the entire afternoon in motion, something that would soon echo far beyond that quiet stretch of highway, when he said, "Well, today you picked the wrong road. Because around here we take illegal machines seriously," and Marcus Reed simply looked at him for a long second before answering in a calm voice that carried an odd kind of certainty when he said, "Officer, I think you might want to be very careful about the decisions you make next." Officer Derek Collins held Marcus Reed's gaze for a moment after that warning, the kind of quiet stare that usually made people look away first. But Marcus did not move, and the stillness between them stretched across the dusty roadside, while the summer wind pushed dry grass back and forth like slow waves. Collins let out a small breath through his nose and shook his head, as if the comment had amused him more than anything else. Then he turned slightly and gestured toward the motorcycle with a casual flick of his hand, saying that people always start talking about mistakes when they know they have already made one, especially when they are riding something that looks like it rolled out of a junkyard instead of a licensed garage. Marcus remained seated on the bike, one hand resting lightly on the handlebar, his expression calm in a way that almost seemed out of place against the growing tension in the air. And he repeated quietly that the motorcycle was fully registered and that the documents were in the saddlebag if the officer wished to review them. Officer Collins glanced at the bag again, but did not reach for it. instead walking another slow circle around the Harley while gravel cracked under his boots, his eyes scanning every bolt and pipe as if he expected the machine to confess to some hidden violation. Behind him, Officer Tyler Grant leaned against the patrol vehicle watching the exchange, the flashing lights painting brief streaks of red and blue across the chrome of the motorcycle. Another car rolled past at 30 miles per hour, the driver lowering the window slightly to see what was happening before continuing down the highway. Collins finally stopped near the rear tire and crouched slightly to inspect the exhaust, tapping one of the pipes with his knuckle before straightening up again. And when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone used to making decisions that others could not challenge, saying that in his experience bikes like this usually had modifications that did not pass inspection and that sometimes riders hoped no one would look too closely. Marcus listened without interrupting, then replied in the same, even tone that inspections were completed every year and that the documentation could confirm it. Collins gave a short laugh again and turned toward the patrol car, where Grant stood waiting, then said loud enough for both men to hear that paperwork could say many things, but what mattered was what the officer saw standing right in front of him. The heat of the afternoon pressed down heavier now, the kind of heat that made the horizon blur and slowed the movement of everything except the flashing patrol lights. Collins walked back toward Marcus until they stood only a few feet apart, the smell of warm asphalt rising around them, and he folded his arms while studying the rider more carefully, as if trying to read something beyond the surface. Marcus met the look with quiet patience, not defensive, not angry, simply steady, and that calm seemed to irritate Collins even more than any argument would have. A faint sound of another vehicle approached somewhere down the road, but it was still far away, leaving the moment suspended in the open air. Collins finally spoke again, this time with a tone that carried less humor and more decision, saying that whether the bike was registered or not, he believed there were enough issues with it to justify taking a closer look and possibly removing it from the road until everything was verified. Marcus slowly nodded once and said that the officer could inspect whatever he needed, but he should be certain of his conclusions before taking action. Collins raised an eyebrow at that remark and asked why exactly that mattered so much, and Marcus answered with the same calm certainty as before, explaining that sometimes the smallest decision on a quiet highway could follow a person much farther than they expected. Officer Derek Collins watched Marcus read for several seconds after that answer, and something about the calm confidence in the man's voice seemed to linger in the warm air like a sentence that had not finished yet. But Collins brushed the feeling aside the way someone ignores a distant storm they believe will never reach them. He turned away from the motorcycle and walked slowly toward the patrol vehicle, where Officer Tyler Grant still leaned against the door, the red and blue lights continuing their silent rhythm across the pavement and the chrome surfaces nearby. Collins spoke in a lower voice now, but still loud enough for Marcus to hear pieces of the conversation drifting across the gravel shoulder, saying that the bike looked questionable from every angle and that sometimes riders tried to pass off modified machines as legal just because they believed officers would not bother checking. Grant glanced toward Marcus for a moment and then back at Collins before answering that the rider did not seem nervous and that the documents might settle the matter quickly if they simply reviewed them. Collins gave a slight shake of his head as if that suggestion had already been considered and dismissed. Then he looked back toward the motorcycle again, studying Marcus with narrowed eyes as the man sat quietly in the saddle without the smallest sign of impatience. Another pickup truck passed on the highway, slowing briefly before continuing down the road, and now two drivers had pulled over farther down the shoulder, watching from a distance, as if sensing that something unusual was unfolding in the afternoon heat. Collins stepped back toward the motorcycle again and rested one hand on his belt while speaking with the measured authority of someone announcing a conclusion rather than starting a discussion, explaining that the condition of the exhaust system alone raised serious questions and that until everything could be verified, he believed the motorcycle might need to be removed from the roadway for further inspection. Marcus listened carefully and then asked in the same steady tone whether the officer had already confirmed that the modifications violated any specific state code, because according to the inspection records the machine met every requirement listed under the transportation guidelines. Collins responded with a short laugh again and said that officers did not always need a printed code in their hands to recognize a problem when they saw one. and that experience on the road often told the story faster than paperwork ever could. The sun shifted slightly in the sky, casting longer shadows across the gravel shoulder, while a faint breeze carried the scent of hot asphalt through the air. Marcus slowly removed one hand from the handlebar and rested it calmly on his knee, still making no move toward the saddlebag where the documents waited. And he said quietly that he respected the officer's experience, but decisions made without facts sometimes created situations that were difficult to undo later. Collins tilted his head at that remark, his expression somewhere between irritation and disbelief, as if he could not decide whether the rider was warning him or simply speaking in general terms. Behind them, the patrol lights continued to flash against the quiet countryside, and for a moment the entire highway seemed to pause around the scene while the tension settled deeper into the silence. Collins finally straightened his shoulders and looked directly at Marcus again before replying that the only thing difficult here would be explaining why someone thought they could challenge an officer's judgment on the side of the road. Marcus held the officer's gaze calmly and answered in the same quiet voice that he was not challenging anything, only reminding him that the law worked best when every step was taken carefully, especially when people were watching. The silence that followed Marcus Reed's last sentence seemed to stretch across the highway like heat rising from the asphalt, and Officer Derek Collins did not like the feeling at all because he was used to conversations ending when he decided they were over, not when someone else calmly suggested caution. He took a slow step back from the motorcycle and glanced once more along the frame and exhaust pipes, as if the machine itself had personally offended him. Then he turned slightly toward Officer Tyler Grant and spoke with the tone of someone already reaching a decision, explaining that the condition of the motorcycle and the unusual setup of the exhaust gave him enough reason to question whether the vehicle truly met state road standards. Grant shifted his weight against the patrol vehicle and looked again toward Marcus, who remained seated on the Harley with the same steady composure, the sunlight reflecting softly across the curved metal of the fuel tank. Another sedan slowed as it passed, the driver lifting a phone toward the window, recording from a distance the way people often do when they sense a moment that might become important later. Collins noticed the growing attention and straightened his uniform slightly, as if the presence of witnesses made the situation even more personal, and he walked back toward the motorcycle with a firmer stride than before. When he stopped in front of Marcus again, his expression carried the quiet certainty of someone who had decided the discussion had gone on long enough. He said that sometimes people believe calm words and paperwork could talk their way out of a problem, but on the side of the road, the officer responsible for public safety had the authority to make immediate calls. Marcus listened carefully and replied that authority was important, but it worked best when paired with clear facts, because the road belonged to everyone and every action taken there could carry consequences far beyond the moment. Collins folded his arms again and looked down briefly at the motorcycle before saying that the problem with machines like this was that riders often treated them as personal statements instead of legal vehicles, and that when a motorcycle looked questionable, the safest solution was to remove it from the roadway until the situation was fully resolved. The warm wind moved through the tall grass along the ditch and carried the faint smell of fuel and dust through the air, while the flashing patrol lights continued their steady rhythm. Marcus finally reached toward the saddlebag and rested his hand lightly on the strap, but he did not open it yet, and instead he looked directly at Collins and said in the same calm voice that if the officer believed removing the motorcycle was necessary, then he should be absolutely certain about that choice, because decisions made quickly sometimes traveled much farther than the person making them expected. Collins studied Marcus again, this time longer than before, as if trying to decide whether the rider was speaking from experience or simply confidence, and the presence of the distant onlookers made the moment feel heavier with every passing second. Somewhere down the highway, the faint rumble of another approaching vehicle echoed across the open land, but on that small gravel shoulder, the focus remained locked between the officer and the rider as Collins finally replied that he had made plenty of roadside decisions in his career and none of them had ever come back to trouble him, and he believed this one would be no different. Officer Derek Collins stood with his hands resting on his belt as the afternoon sun continued to press down on the quiet highway, and for a moment the only sounds were the distant hum of passing traffic and the steady clicking of cooling metal from Marcus Reed's motorcycle. Collins had already made up his mind, And the longer Marcus remained calm, the more determined the officer seemed to prove that the situation belonged entirely under his control. He glanced once toward Officer Tyler Grant, near the patrol vehicle, and then back at the motorcycle as if confirming his own conclusion before speaking again, explaining that when an officer believed a vehicle posed a potential legal issue, it could be removed from public roads until authorities verified every detail. Marcus listened carefully and slowly nodded, as if he had heard similar explanations many times before, and he replied in a calm voice that procedures existed for a reason, and that if the officer believed further inspection was necessary, he would cooperate fully. The tone of Marcus's response carried neither anger nor fear, only a quiet patience that seemed almost out of place on the side of a rural highway where most people would have already raised their voices. Collins noticed that calm again and interpreted it as resistance hidden behind polite words. So he stepped closer to the motorcycle and gestured toward the exhaust pipes and rear frame, saying that machines like this often hid modifications that riders believed would never be questioned. He added that when officers encountered a situation that did not look right, the safest option sometimes meant removing the problem completely until it could not create trouble for anyone else on the road. The warm wind shifted across the gravel shoulder and stirred the dry grass beside the ditch, while the red and blue patrol lights continued their quiet rhythm across the pavement. Farther down the highway, two vehicles remained parked along the shoulder, their drivers still watching from a distance, as if they sensed the moment was slowly building toward something bigger. Marcus rested both hands lightly on the handlebars and looked down briefly at the black paint of the fuel tank before lifting his eyes back toward Collins. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the same steady certainty that had been present since the first moment the patrol lights appeared behind him. He said that decisions made on the roadside sometimes seemed small at first, but could grow much larger once people began asking questions about how those decisions were made. Collins responded with a faint smile that held more confidence than humor, replying that he had spent years making calls like this, and that the responsibility belonged to him, not to the person sitting on the motorcycle. He gestured once more toward the machine and added that if the bike truly met every requirement, then the owner would have nothing to worry about once the inspection process was complete. Marcus nodded slowly again and replied that he understood the officer's position, but he also believed every official action carried a weight that followed it wherever the law eventually traveled. Collins looked at him with a hint of impatience and asked whether the rider was trying to warn him about something, and Marcus answered quietly that he was only reminding him that the law was not just written in books or printed on documents. It was carried by the people who were responsible for protecting it. The wind moved across the open fields again, and somewhere in the distance the faint sound of an approaching engine echoed along the road. But neither man turned to look yet, because the focus remained locked on the decision that Officer Collins was about to make. Officer Derek Collins stood beside the motorcycle with the firm posture of someone who believed the matter was already settled, the afternoon sun glinting off the badge on his chest, while the red and blue patrol lights continued to flash behind him in steady rhythm. The warm air carried the distant hum of vehicles along the highway, but on that narrow gravel shoulder the tension between the officer and the rider seemed to hold everything else in place. Collins glanced once more at the Harley, his eyes tracing the lines of the exhaust pipes and the worn black frame before he spoke with quiet finality, explaining that the motorcycle would need to be taken off the road until the department could verify whether it met the necessary regulations. Marcus Reed listened without interrupting, his posture relaxed yet attentive, both hands resting lightly on the handlebars as if the machine beneath him were simply another part of the landscape rather than the center of a growing dispute. He nodded once and replied that if the officer believed that was the correct step, then he would not interfere, but he repeated calmly that every official decision carried a responsibility that followed the person who made it. Collins let out a small breath through his nose and replied that responsibility was part of the job and that roadside decisions had to be made quickly for the sake of safety. Then he gestured toward Officer Tyler Grant near the patrol vehicle, as if confirming that the next action would move forward. Grant stepped slightly closer, though his expression remained uncertain, and he glanced again toward Marcus before looking back at Collins. The quiet rumble of another engine approached from somewhere farther down the road, still distant but slowly growing louder against the stillness of the countryside. Marcus finally moved his hand from the handlebar and reached calmly into the pocket of his jacket, pulling out a simple black phone that reflected the sunlight in a brief flash. Collins watched the movement carefully and asked what he was doing, his voice carrying a hint of impatience now that the situation seemed ready to move toward resolution. Marcus looked down at the phone screen for a moment before answering that he was simply making a call to inform someone that there might be a delay in his afternoon schedule. Collins raised an eyebrow and replied that anyone he needed to inform would likely hear about the delay soon enough once the motorcycle was transported for inspection. Marcus did not respond to the comment directly, instead placing the phone to his ear and waiting quietly while the call connected. The wind moved softly through the dry grass along the roadside while the two distant drivers who had stopped earlier continued watching from their vehicles. After a brief moment, Marcus spoke into the phone with calm clarity, saying that he would be arriving later than expected because a situation on the highway required attention, and that it might help if someone from the county offices came to observe what was happening. Collins listened to the words without understanding their full meaning, but the tone carried a strange certainty that made the officer glance once toward Grant again. Marcus ended the call, just as calmly as he had started it, and slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket before looking up at Collins once more. The rumble of approaching engines was louder now somewhere down the highway, though the vehicles were still not visible over the distant rise in the road. Marcus rested his hands again on the handlebars and spoke in the same composed voice he had used since the beginning of the encounter, saying that the officer should proceed however he believed necessary, because sometimes the best way to understand a decision was simply to let it unfold. The low rumble that had been echoing in the distance finally crested the long rise in the highway, and within seconds the shapes of several dark vehicles appeared against the bright horizon, moving steadily toward the scene with a smooth and deliberate pace that felt different from ordinary traffic. Officer Derek Collins noticed them first and turned his head slightly, narrowing his eyes against the sunlight as the line of vehicles approached, their polished black surfaces reflecting the afternoon glare like mirrors cutting across the open road. Beside the patrol SUV, Officer Tyler Grant also shifted his stance and looked down the highway, the sound of multiple engines growing louder with each passing second. The vehicles did not slow the way curious drivers usually did when passing a roadside stop. Instead, they continued directly toward the gravel shoulder where Collins and Marcus Reed stood facing one another. The red and blue patrol lights still flashed against the asphalt while the warm wind drifted across the fields, carrying the faint smell of hot dust and summer grass. Marcus remained seated on the Harley with the same calm posture he had shown from the beginning, his hands resting loosely on the handlebars as if he had been expecting this exact moment to arrive. Collins turned his attention back to Marcus briefly and asked whether those vehicles had something to do with the phone call that had just been made. Though his tone carried more skepticism than concern, Marcus did not answer the question directly and instead watched the approaching convoy with quiet patience, the sunlight glinting across the chrome of the motorcycle as the engines grew louder. Within moments, the first black SUV slowed and pulled onto the shoulder about 20 yards away, followed by two more vehicles that stopped in a precise line behind it. Their engines idled softly, the deep mechanical sound mixing with the ticking metal of the patrol car and the distant buzz of insects in the grass. The drivers who had been watching from farther down the road now stepped out of their vehicles, curiosity drawing them closer though they remained at a respectful distance. The door of the first SUV opened, and a woman in a dark professional suit stepped out, her posture straight and her expression focused as she scanned the scene in front of her. When her eyes landed on Marcus Reed, her expression changed instantly from alert attention to unmistakable recognition. She walked forward several steps across the gravel shoulder and stopped beside the motorcycle before speaking in a clear, respectful tone that carried across the quiet roadside. "Good afternoon, sir. We were informed there might be a situation here." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment as Officer Collins looked from the woman to Marcus and back again, trying to understand why her voice carried the careful respect usually reserved for someone in a position of authority. Marcus slowly turned his head toward her and gave a small nod of acknowledgement before replying that the officer here was simply making a decision about his motorcycle and that he had suggested it might be useful for someone from the county offices to observe how the situation unfolded. The woman listened carefully and then glanced briefly toward Collins, her expression calm, but noticeably serious now as she asked in a measured voice whether the officer could explain exactly what decision had been made. Officer Derek Collins felt the weight of several pairs of eyes settle on him as the woman in the dark suit waited for his explanation, the quiet authority in her voice making the roadside suddenly feel less like a routine stop and more like something being carefully examined. The afternoon sun reflected off the black SUVs parked in a precise line behind her, while the red and blue lights from the patrol vehicle continued their steady flash across the asphalt. Collins straightened his posture and cleared his throat slightly before answering that he had stopped the rider because the motorcycle appeared to have modifications that might violate road regulations, and that he had been preparing to remove the vehicle from the highway until the matter could be fully verified. The woman listened without interrupting, her expression controlled and professional, though her eyes briefly shifted toward Marcus Reed, as if confirming that the explanation matched what she expected to hear. Officer Tyler Grant stood quietly beside the patrol SUV, watching the exchange with growing curiosity while the distant drivers who had gathered along the shoulder leaned closer to see what would happen next. Marcus remained seated on the Harley with the same calm composure he had shown since the beginning, the sunlight glinting off the chrome near his hands while the warm wind moved gently through the roadside grass. The woman turned her attention fully toward him now and spoke with respectful formality, asking whether he had already presented the registration and inspection records for the motorcycle. Marcus shook his head slightly and replied that the officer had not requested them directly yet, though he had mentioned that the vehicle might be removed from the roadway regardless. A brief silence followed those words, and Collins shifted his weight slightly on the gravel, as if the situation had begun moving in a direction he had not expected. The woman looked back at him again and asked in a measured voice whether the inspection documents had been reviewed before the decision was considered. Collins answered that experience often allowed an officer to recognize potential issues without needing immediate paperwork, and that roadside safety sometimes required quick judgment calls. The woman studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. Then she turned once more toward Marcus Reed with a quiet respect that did not go unnoticed by anyone standing nearby. Marcus finally moved his hand toward the saddlebag and unfastened the strap with a calm, deliberate motion, the small metal buckle clicking softly in the still air. He reached inside and removed a neatly folded document wallet before opening it and holding up an identification card between his fingers. The afternoon sunlight caught the edge of the badge printed beside the official seal as he spoke in the same composed voice he had used throughout the entire encounter. He said that the motorcycle was fully registered and inspected under state law, and that he had been on his way to a scheduled meeting when the stop occurred. Then he paused for a brief moment and added something that caused the atmosphere along the highway to shift instantly when he explained that the meeting he was heading to was a county judicial session scheduled later that afternoon. The woman standing beside him inclined her head slightly and addressed him with unmistakable respect as she said, "Yes, Your Honor, we were informed you might be delayed." And the words hung in the quiet air long enough for Officer Collins to realize that the calm rider he had been questioning was not simply another traveler on the road. The moment the words "Your Honor" settled into the warm afternoon air, the atmosphere along the quiet highway shifted in a way that everyone present could feel even before anyone spoke again. Officer Derek Collins stood motionless beside the motorcycle as the meaning of the title slowly caught up with the events that had unfolded over the last several minutes. The flashing red and blue lights from his patrol vehicle suddenly seeming louder against the stillness of the open fields. Marcus Reed remained seated on the Harley with the same calm posture he had carried from the beginning, the document wallet still resting lightly in his hand, while the official identification caught the sunlight for a brief second before he lowered it again. The woman who had stepped from the black SUV gave a respectful nod toward him, and then turned her attention back to Collins with a composed but unmistakably serious expression, asking quietly whether the officer had completed his assessment of the motorcycle or whether he would prefer to review the inspection records now that the documents were available. Collins opened his mouth as if to answer, but the confidence that had filled his voice earlier was no longer there, replaced instead by the careful tone of someone realizing that the situation had become far more significant than a routine roadside stop. He explained that the motorcycle had appeared unusual from a distance, and that he had believed it might contain modifications that required verification before allowing it to continue down the highway. Marcus listened without interruption and then spoke in the same steady voice that had carried through every part of the encounter, explaining that questioning a vehicle was not a problem when it was done carefully and fairly, because the law existed to protect both safety and fairness on the road. He paused briefly while the warm wind moved across the gravel shoulder and the watching driver stood silently along the roadside. Then he added that the most important part of any authority was not the badge or the title attached to it, but the responsibility to use it wisely. The woman beside the SUV nodded slightly at those words, while Officer Tyler Grant lowered his gaze toward the pavement, clearly understanding that the lesson unfolding in front of them would be remembered long after the patrol lights were turned off. Collins looked once more at the motorcycle and then at Marcus Reed before quietly saying that he would review the documents and confirm that everything met the proper standards. Marcus handed the inspection papers forward with calm patience, allowing the officer to examine them while the countryside remained silent except for the distant sound of traffic miles away. After a moment, Collins returned the documents and stepped back, acknowledging that the motorcycle appeared to meet the legal requirements he had questioned earlier. Marcus placed the papers back into the saddlebag and secured the strap before resting his hands on the handlebars again. The woman from the county office then asked whether he still planned to attend the judicial session scheduled that afternoon, and Marcus answered that he did, because the work of the law continued regardless of unexpected delays along the road. He started the engine of the Harley, and the deep, steady rumble rolled softly across the quiet highway as he prepared to continue his ride. Before pulling away, he looked once more toward Officer Collins and spoke a final sentence that carried far beyond the roadside stop, explaining that authority could command obedience for a moment, but fairness earned respect that lasted far longer. Then he eased the motorcycle back onto the road and rode toward the distant courthouse, while the flashing patrol lights faded behind him and the quiet lesson of the afternoon lingered in the warm air long after he disappeared over the horizon.